December 19, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell thick and silent, muffling the distant thunder of artillery. Beneath a canopy of shattered pines, a German anti-tank crew waited, breath freezing in the air, eyes fixed on the white road ahead. Their orders were simple: stop the American advance. Nothing moves past this point. Through the swirling snow, the rumble came, deep, rhythmic, metallic. Shermans, a whole column of them, grinding through the slush, their olive hulls half hidden by frost and fog. The lead tank crested the rise, engine growling. "Fire!" The German gunner fired. A blinding flash split the air. The shell struck the Sherman squarely on its hull. A perfect hit. For a moment, the men cheered. But then the smoke cleared. The tank was still moving. Another shot. Another impact. Still, the American tank pressed forward, its turret swinging toward them like a living thing. The Germans stared in disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. Their 88mm guns could destroy anything but this. The myth of American weakness had just been shattered, one shell at a time. The Battle of the Bulge, fought in the depths of winter between December 16, 1944 and January 25, 1945, was the last major German offensive on the Western Front during World War II. It was a desperate gambit, a final attempt by Adolf Hitler to divide the Allied forces, seize the vital port of Antwerp, and turn the tide of the war in favor of the Third Reich. In the days leading up to the battle, the Germans launched a surprise attack through the Ardennes Forest, a thick, snow-covered region in Belgium. The German forces, numbering around 250,000 troops, were equipped with some of the finest tanks of the war, the Panther and the Tiger II, King Tiger. These tanks were heavily armored, well-armed, and had a reputation for being nearly invincible. Their 88mm guns could blast through the thickest armor at long range, making them the feared weapon of the Wehrmacht. On the other side, the Allied forces, consisting mainly of U.S. troops, were underprepared for the offensive. They had not expected such an attack through this remote region. While their forces were still reeling from the heavy casualties suffered in previous battles, they had no choice but to defend the Ardennes with everything they had. At the time, the U.S. Army's Sherman tank was widely regarded as inferior to the German heavy tanks. The Sherman had been the workhorse of the Allied armored forces since the early days of the war. It was lighter and faster than the German tanks, but was not as heavily armored. The Sherman's 75mm gun was less powerful compared to the German 88mm, and its armor was thin, making it vulnerable to German fire. American tankers had learned the hard way to adapt tactics quickly to the weaknesses of their vehicles. They used speed, maneuverability, and coordination with infantry and artillery to overcome the German superiority in firepower and armor. Despite its weaknesses, the Sherman was the backbone of the American armored forces, and thousands of these tanks had been deployed on the Western Front. By the time of the Battle of the Bulge, the U.S. Army had adapted its tactics for fighting in the harsh European winter and had begun to modify the Sherman. They had introduced new versions of the tank, including the M4A3E8, known as the Easy 8. This version of the Sherman was upgraded with better suspension, allowing it to cross rough terrain and operate more effectively in the icy roads of Belgium. It also had a more powerful 76mm gun and reinforced armor, making it a more formidable opponent to the German tanks. Still, the Germans had the advantage of surprise, and the Americans were deeply outnumbered and isolated in the fog of war. They were facing a German force that believed it was invincible. The Germans assumed that their superior armor and firepower would quickly crush the Allied tanks, pushing them out of the Ardennes and possibly ending the war on their terms. What the Germans did not know, however, was that the Sherman's evolution had already begun to shift the balance of power. The improved armor and tactical ingenuity of the U.S. Army tank battalions would soon become apparent, especially when their tanks took the first direct hits from German guns and kept moving forward. As the Battle of the Bulge began in December 1944, the German offensive came with an overwhelming initial advantage. The Germans exploited gaps in the American lines, advancing through the dense Ardennes Forest, where Allied forces were spread thin. The element of surprise was key. Most of the American troops had been engaged in offensive operations for months and were unprepared for the ferocity of the German attack. They lacked the fuel, supplies, and reinforcements to mount an immediate response. The weather also played a critical role, with heavy snowstorms and fog reducing visibility, making it difficult for the Allies to call in air support or coordinate their defenses. The German tanks, especially the Panther and Tiger II, thrived in these conditions. Their heavier armor and longer-range 88mm guns made them perfect for picking off American tanks from a distance. The Americans, on the other hand, faced the problem of operating in a harsh winter environment without the advanced armor or firepower to match the German giants. While U.S. tankers knew the Sherman was at a disadvantage when it came to raw firepower, they also understood that tactics and teamwork could make up for those weaknesses. American tanks were fast, agile, and easy to maintain, which allowed them to quickly adapt to the changing battlefield. In particular, U.S. commanders favored speed and maneuverability, using Shermans in coordinated assaults alongside infantry and artillery to outflank and overwhelm German positions. But when faced with direct fire from German tanks, the Sherman's thin armor often made it vulnerable to a single shot that could disable or destroy the tank. It was here, in the freezing fog of the Ardennes winter, that the newly modified Sherman tanks, particularly the M4A3E8, would show their potential. This variant of the Sherman had been upgraded with a powerful 76mm gun, better suspension, and improved armor protection. While not invulnerable, the M4A3E8 was better suited to surviving the devastating hits from German 80mm guns, especially when compared to earlier models. The tanks were also equipped with wet stowage, a key modification that protected the ammunition from igniting when hit. But the true test came when German anti-tank units, armed with 80mm guns and Panzerfausts, went head-to-head with these American tanks. The Germans assumed their famed 88mm gun would tear through the Shermans with ease. Their belief was rooted in past encounters with the Americans, where Shermans were often destroyed with a single shot. Yet, when the first direct hits landed on the M4A3E8s, something unexpected happened. The Shermans didn't stop. The German crews, expecting the American tanks to burst into flames, watched in stunned silence as the Shermans kept moving. This was a moment that would change the perception of the American tank in the minds of both the German soldiers and the American crews themselves. What had once been considered a fragile, underpowered tank was now beginning to show the world that American industry, innovation, and adaptability could overcome even the strongest defenses. The psychological impact on the German soldiers was immediate. Their sense of superiority, built on their belief that their tanks could crush anything, began to falter. They had been prepared to fight an easy battle, but they now faced an enemy that was resilient, adaptive, and determined. This moment marked a critical turning point in the Battle of the Bulge, not just in terms of tactics, but in how each side viewed the other's ability to fight and survive. For the men inside those Sherman tanks, the Battle of the Bulge was not only a fight against the enemy, it was a test of endurance. The American tankers were young, many still in their early 20s, facing the grueling realities of war in the bitter cold of a European winter. They were inside cramped, hot machines, their tank turrets and engines rattling violently with each movement, often under direct German artillery fire. The fear and anxiety inside those tanks were constant companions. Tank crews, already feeling the fatigue of months of combat, now faced the German offensive in the Ardennes, with German Tiger tanks and 80mm guns lurking in the snow-covered forests. The American soldiers knew the reputation of the Tiger II tank, a beast of war capable of shredding even the heaviest armor. But the M4 Shermans, despite their flaws, were the best tanks the U.S. Army had. One of the defining features of the Sherman was its crew's bond, forged by the need for constant communication and mutual reliance. Tankers worked together to overcome the mechanical challenges that the M4 Shermans presented. When a German shell hit, the crew's first thought was not about personal survival, but about the tank's functionality. Was the engine still running? Did they still have ammunition? Could they keep fighting? The crews were trained to operate as a well-oiled machine, ensuring that even if a shell hit their tank, they would continue to fight. When direct hits from German 88mm rounds or Panzerfausts slammed into their tanks, the men inside were often sure their tanks were finished. But the shock came when the Sherman kept moving. The psychological impact of this moment was as profound for the tank crews as it was for the Germans. Tankers who had been conditioned to expect immediate destruction were stunned by their tank's ability to keep moving, even after a direct hit. For the Germans, too, the human element was powerful. German tank crews, accustomed to facing the Sherman's weakness, watched in astonishment as the American tanks bore the hits and continued their advance. The realization that the Sherman tanks were not as vulnerable as the Germans had assumed shook their belief in their superiority. Some German soldiers even reported that after seeing Shermans keep moving after direct hits, they began to feel a deep unease, not only about the capabilities of the American tanks, but about their own tanks' vulnerability. This battle, where the Sherman's resilience turned the tide, was a human moment as much as it was a technological one. The American soldiers' resilience, adaptability, and courage, fighting through fear, doubt, and exhaustion, helped them achieve what many believed to be impossible, holding off the German offensive. For both sides, this moment would forever mark a turning point in how they viewed the battlefield. The tactical advantage the U.S. Army gained from the Sherman tanks' survival after direct hits went beyond the armor and engineering improvements. When the German forces launched their surprise attack during the Battle of the Bulge, they expected an easy victory. The Germans were confident that their Panther and Tiger II tanks, massive war machines with thick armor and powerful 88-meter guns, could dominate the battlefield. What they didn't anticipate was the evolution in American tactics and the unexpected resilience of their tanks. At the core of the U.S. Army's approach was combined arms warfare, where infantry, artillery, and armor worked together. In previous years, the U.S. tank units had been forced to engage in direct assaults, often making themselves vulnerable. However, by the time of the Battle of the Bulge, the American tank doctrine had evolved. The M4 Sherman tanks were no longer seen as just a means of brute force. They were tools for flexible, rapid movement that could support infantry and artillery, helping to break up German attacks and disrupt defensive lines. The improved armor and suspension system in the Sherman M4A3E8 EZ8 allowed American tank crews to outmaneuver German positions, often working in concert with infantry units. The Germans were accustomed to fighting in open fields, where their larger tanks could unleash devastating firepower. But in the Ardennes, where visibility was poor and snow piled high, the Germans found it more difficult to leverage the long-range firepower of their Panthers and Tigers. The Shermans, with their increased maneuverability, proved to be more adaptable to the changing battlefield conditions. While not as heavily armored or armed as the German tanks, the M4A3E8 Shermans were faster, more agile, and could keep up with the rapid changes in terrain and tactics. This flexibility allowed American tankers to close the distance quickly, using their superior speed and coordination to flank the Germans and neutralize their firepower. The Americans used their tanks not as individual war machines, but as part of a broader combined arms strategy. They focused on moving quickly, disrupting enemy supply lines, and forcing German tanks into positions where they could be ambushed. The Sherman's survival after a direct hit became symbolic of the Americans' tactical resilience. Even in the most hostile terrain and under the heaviest fire, the Allied tankers could find ways to adapt, respond, and overcome. For the Germans, this was a hard lesson. Their reliance on the overwhelming firepower of the 88mm gun was no longer sufficient. The Sherman tanks were now able to survive hits and continue the fight, while the German tanks remained vulnerable when faced with flanking and surprise tactics. The Germans, who had once seen their tanks as invincible, were now being forced into retreat by speed and adaptability, qualities they had underestimated in their enemies. When the first German shells slammed into the Sherman tanks during the Battle of the Bulge, the immediate assumption of many on both sides was that these American tanks would be destroyed just as they had been in previous engagement. The German 80mm guns were feared for their ability to penetrate even the thickest armor, and their reputation was earned on battlefields from North Africa to the Eastern Front. But as direct hits landed and the Shermans kept advancing, it was clear that something had changed. The American tanks were different now. The Sherman's evolution had been driven by real-world experience after suffering enormous losses in the earlier stages of the war, particularly during the Normandy campaign. The American military engineers had been forced to adapt their designs. The original Sherman tank, though reliable and easy to mass-produce, was vulnerable to the more powerful German tanks. Its thin armor and relatively weak firepower often made it an easy target for German gunners. By late 1944, however, the Sherman M4A3E8, known as the Easy 8, had been introduced. This model included significant upgrades designed specifically to improve its survivability on the battlefield. The most notable change was the improved armor and the addition of wet stowage for ammunition. In earlier Shermans, the ammunition was stored in unprotected bins inside the turret. When a tank was hit in the turret or hull, the shells inside would often ignite, causing the tank to explode. The introduction of wet stowage meant the ammunition was now protected by water-filled compartments, which helped prevent fires from reaching the munitions and causing catastrophic explosions. This was one of the key reasons why American tanks were able to withstand direct hits and continue fighting. In addition to the wet stowage, the M4A3E8 also had an upgraded suspension system that made it more maneuverable and better equipped to handle rough terrain, such as the snow-covered, crater-filled landscapes of the Ardennes. This system gave the Sherman a distinct advantage over the German Tiger and Panther tanks, which, though heavier and better armored, were more difficult to move quickly across difficult terrain. The Sherman's ability to navigate this terrain with speed and agility made it a more effective combat vehicle in the forest and hill environments of the Battle of the Bulge, where German tanks struggled. The 76mm gun, fitted to the M4A3E8, provided a more powerful punch, allowing American tanks to engage the Germans more effectively. While still not a match for the 80mm guns of the German tanks, the 76mm gun allowed Shermans to penetrate the weaker parts of German tank armor, such as the turret or rear. The combination of better armor, more powerful guns, and increased maneuverability allowed the M4A3E8 Shermans to take hits that would have destroyed earlier models and continue to engage the Germans. But what truly set the Sherman apart in this battle was the mechanical resilience that allowed it to keep moving even after a direct hit. Where a German tank might be immobilized after being hit in the turret or track, the American Shermans often kept fighting, even if they were damaged. The American approach to tank design focused on producing quantity over perfection, and while the Sherman had flaws, it was also a tank that could be quickly repaired in the field and put back into action. For the Germans, this was a revelation. The 82mm guns, which had long been the feared weapon of the German arsenal, were now failing to achieve the decisive results they had once delivered. Despite direct hits, many Shermans did not explode or catch fire as expected. Some tanks, though damaged, were able to retreat or reposition and continue the fight. This was the moment when German tank crews realized that the battlefield was changing. They had expected the Sherman to be vulnerable, a weak opponent that could be picked off with ease, but instead, they found themselves facing an enemy whose resilience seemed to defy the laws of war. This technological shift had a profound impact on the German forces. The psychological shock of watching American tanks continue to fight after being hit caused German tank crews to question their own assumptions about the battlefield. They had assumed that the Tiger II, with its superior armor and firepower, would crush the American armor. But the Sherman's adaptability left them uncertain and vulnerable. It was not only a matter of technology, it was about tactical adaptation. The U.S. Army had learned from their mistakes and had improved the design of the Sherman, turning it from a symbol of American vulnerability into a testament to resilience. This shift in the technological landscape fundamentally altered the course of the Battle of the Bulge, allowing American tank crews to push through the German lines and eventually force the Wehrmacht's retreat. It is December 1944, deep in the Ardennes Forest, where the Battle of the Bulge is reaching its fever pitch. The temperature hovers near freezing, snow falling in thick, wet sheets, as German forces launch their surprise attack. The U.S. Army is scattered, unprepared for the sudden onslaught. But the American tanks, particularly the newly upgraded M4A3E8 Shermans, are about to face a test unlike any before. A German anti-tank crew waits in ambush. They know the Americans are coming. Their position is well rehearsed, perfect for a Panzerfaust strike or the devastating impact of their 80mm guns. The Sherman is no match for this level of firepower, they believe. The American tank column emerges from the fog, the low rumble of engines cutting through the forest's stillness. The lead Sherman's turret swivels, scanning the horizon. The German soldiers, their fingers tightening around the triggers of their guns, hold their breath. Target locked. The first shot is fired. The 80mm round thunders through the air. It strikes the Sherman directly on the hull. A perfect hit. The explosion echoes through the trees, snow flurries dancing in the air. The German crew, hidden behind their positions, brace for the inevitable explosion. The Sherman should be incinerated. But then, something extraordinary happens. The Sherman tank keeps moving. The German crew stares in disbelief. Their superior firepower, their belief that no tank could survive this hit, has been proven wrong. The Sherman shakes, its turret slowly turning, but it does not burn. It does not stop. The tank continues to push forward, its crew determined to keep fighting. For the Americans inside the tank, the scene is a blur of excitement, fear, and exhaustion. Inside their cramped quarters, the blast rattles their nerves. But their training kicks in. The crew's mission remains unchanged. Continue to fight, continue to push forward. They assess their tank's condition. The gun still works, the engine still runs, and despite the hit, they have not lost mobility. The impact of this moment ripples far beyond the battlefield. For the German tank crews, the shock is immediate. They have just witnessed the impossible. The American Sherman, often mocked for its perceived fragility, has defied all expectations. The 80mm shell that should have reduced it to a burning wreck has done little to stop it. The reality of American resilience, not just in tanks but in tactics, is revealed in an instant. Inside the Sherman tank, the crew knows something has changed. The German tanks that once seemed invincible now seem vulnerable. Their earlier misjudgment of the American tank becomes clear. They had assumed the Sherman could be destroyed easily, and that American armor was no match for the heavier, more powerful German tanks. But the Sherman's survival, after taking a direct hit, forces them to reevaluate everything they thought they knew. For the American tank crews, this moment of survival is a revelation. The Sherman's armor, modified with wet stowage and thicker metal, has withstood the German 88mm hit, proving that American tanks were no longer the easy targets they had once been. The German belief that the Americans' tanks could be picked off easily was unraveling. The Sherman may not be as perfect as the Tiger II, but it was far tougher than anyone had given it credit for. The German anti-tank crew, watching in disbelief as the Sherman keeps moving, is now forced to adapt. Their tactical assumptions have been shattered, and their confidence begins to waver. In that moment, the balance of the battle shifts, not just in terms of technology, but in terms of psychological warfare. The Germans begin to question their own advantage. They had assumed the Sherman was inferior, but now they are faced with an enemy that refuses to break. They have been forced to confront the reality that, perhaps, the American forces were far more formidable than they had expected. As the American tank column presses forward through the thick Ardennes snow, the German forces begin to realize they are fighting a very different war than they had anticipated. The M4A3E8 Shermans, having withstood the first shock of direct hits from the feared 80mm guns, now continue to advance, their engines roaring as they push past the positions where German soldiers had expected the tanks to crumble. In the midst of the chaos, German tank crews and anti-tank gunners are forced to recalculate their strategy. They begin to move into defensive positions, preparing for a new type of engagement. They no longer see the Sherman as a weak opponent. It has shown that American ingenuity and resilience have strengthened it in ways the Germans hadn't counted on. For the Americans, the battle has become a test of grit and resolve. Their Shermans, though not as heavily armored as the German tanks, are not giving in to the German assault. The crew inside each tank knows they are up against some of the most formidable forces the Wehrmacht can muster, yet they continue the fight with the unwavering belief that they can survive. These are not the same tankers who faced the initial chaos of the war, where their tanks were vulnerable and often destroyed. They are now veterans, adapting to the new challenges presented by their enemies' evolving tactics. The tanks' survival after direct hits becomes the symbol of American resilience, and it affects both sides psychologically. For the U.S. tank crews, knowing that their tanks can take such punishment and still keep moving boosts morale. It represents a new belief that their tanks are not just machines. They are tools of survival, capable of defying the enemy's expectations. The crews fight with a renewed sense of confidence, knowing that the American military's adaptability has given them the advantage. The Sherman's armor, combined with the newly enhanced design, means that these tanks can continue to operate even when damaged. It is a game-changer on the battlefield. For the German forces, the realization that their best weapons cannot stop the American tanks begins to seep into their strategic thinking. The 88mm gun, long considered the unbeatable weapon against the Allied forces, has failed. The Panther and Tiger II tanks, which had been designed to dominate the battlefield with their superior armor and firepower, now face an enemy who is not backing down. The Germans, who had expected to crush the American offensive with their superior tanks, now find themselves struggling to deal with the resilience of the Sherman crews and the Allied coordination that has turned the tables. In key moments, German tank commanders are forced to pull back. They are outmaneuvered by American Shermans, whose crews use flanking tactics and speed to their advantage. The Sherman's agility and tactical deployment become its greatest assets. As the snowy Ardennes battlefield becomes a fierce, close-quarters fight, American tanks show that even against overwhelming odds, they can outmaneuver the German forces and adapt to changing conditions. The battle is no longer a matter of firepower alone. It is about the will to push forward, the ability to withstand blows, and the unwavering determination of the American tank crews to keep moving. The battle rages on, but the turning point is clear. The Sherman's unexpected resilience in the face of German firepower marks a psychological shift in the fighting. The Germans, once so confident in their superiority, are now grappling with the realization that the Americans have turned the tables. It is no longer just a battle of tanks. It is a battle of wills, of endurance, and of technological evolution. The M4A3E8 Shermans, once underestimated by the enemy, now stand as symbols of American industrial innovation and tactical brilliance. As the American tanks press forward, the German forces begin to withdraw. They can no longer sustain their offensive, and U.S. forces break through, relieving the siege of Bastogne and sending the Germans into a defensive retreat. The resilience of the Sherman tank and the tactical brilliance behind its use has played a pivotal role in shifting the momentum of the battle. The Battle of the Bulge, once the last German hope for a victory, ends in failure for the Wehrmacht, and the Allied forces are left to march toward the final victory in Europe. The Battle of the Bulge had been a brutal test of both will and steel. The Germans, having invested their final resources into this desperate offensive, were left with nothing but shattered morale and a crippled fighting force. For the U.S. Army, the battle was a pivotal moment that showcased the adaptability and resilience of American forces, particularly in the form of the Sherman tanks. While the Panther and Tiger II tanks had been designed to dominate, it was the Sherman's ability to keep moving after direct hits that had proved to be the real shock to the Germans. As the fighting began to die down in January 1945, the Allied forces emerged victorious, but the cost had been high. Over 19,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. For the Germans, the losses were far steeper, with almost 100,000 casualties, a combination of soldiers killed, wounded, captured, or frozen in the bitter cold. The Germans had lost almost a quarter of their tanks during the battle, but it was the psychological aftermath of the battle that was truly devastating for the German military. The infamous German tanks, once thought invincible, had been consistently outmaneuvered and outlasted by their American counterparts. This would mark the beginning of the end for German tank supremacy. The shock of seeing the Sherman tanks survive direct hits and keep advancing was a blow to the German High Command. They had believed that their superior armor and firepower would overwhelm the Americans. Instead, they were faced with a new reality. The American forces had evolved in ways they hadn't anticipated. The psychological toll on the German soldiers was immense. Morale began to falter in the months that followed, and many soldiers who had previously fought with the belief that their tanks were indestructible were now questioning everything they had been taught. The Shermans' resilience had shattered the myth of German superiority. In fact, German tank crews began to report that they were increasingly hesitant to engage American forces head-on, knowing that direct hits might not mean the end of the battle, but just a temporary setback. For the U.S. Army, the immediate aftermath was a sense of cautious pride. While the Sherman tank was not without its flaws, the Battle of the Bulge proved that American ingenuity had turned its weaknesses into strengths. The upgraded M4A3E8, with its wet stowage and increased armor, had performed far better than expected. In a battle where the odds were stacked against them, the Sherman had stood firm. American crews, who had once feared the deadly 80mm gun, now felt a renewed sense of confidence in their tank's ability to withstand even the heaviest German fire. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge, the American military began to consolidate its gains, and the Sherman tank emerged as a key symbol of the U.S. Army's resolve. The battle had exposed both the strengths and weaknesses of the M4 Sherman, but it also demonstrated the importance of tactical flexibility and the ability to adapt quickly to the evolving nature of modern warfare. Despite the German tank's superior firepower, the Sherman's resilience, coupled with American ingenuity, made it a formidable weapon on the battlefield. The Allied victory was not just about physical battlefield gains. It also provided a significant psychological advantage. German morale had already been declining as the war dragged on, but the Battle of the Bulge marked the beginning of a psychological shift. The Germans had lost their final gamble, and the realization that their superior tanks could no longer guarantee success had a demoralizing effect on their soldiers. German tank crews, once confident in their Tigers and Panthers, now faced the uncomfortable truth. The Americans were no longer an easy target. The Sherman's survival after direct hits forced the German commanders to reassess their strategy, knowing they could no longer count on the superiority of their tanks to win the battle. For the U.S. Army, the victory marked a turning point in how the Sherman tank was viewed. Initially criticized for its vulnerabilities, it had proven itself to be a reliable, adaptable, and resilient workhorse. The Battle of the Bulge solidified the Sherman's reputation as the backbone of the American armored forces. Although it was not as powerful as the German tanks, it was fast, maneuverable, and, more importantly, surprisingly tough under combat conditions. Its survival rate in battle improved dramatically, thanks in part to the design improvements that allowed it to take direct hits and keep moving. This resilience, however, was not just about the Sherman tank itself. It also reflected the American approach to warfare: adaptation, perseverance, and an unyielding commitment to press forward, no matter the odds. The tactical changes implemented by U.S. commanders, alongside the constant evolution of the Sherman tank, created a powerful synergy that allowed the Allied forces to take on the most formidable German tank divisions and emerge victorious. In the months following the Battle of the Bulge, the U.S. Army would continue to apply the lessons learned on the frozen fields of Belgium. The Sherman's design would be further refined in future tank models, including the M26 Pershing, but the M4A3E8 would remain the cornerstone of the American armored forces through the remainder of the European campaign. For the Germans, the psychological impact of the Sherman's survival continued to resonate throughout the remainder of the war. German tank crews, who had once seen themselves as the best on the battlefield, now faced an enemy who had adapted and improved. And that realization marked the beginning of the end for the German war effort. The Battle of the Bulge was a defining moment in the Western Front of World War II, a battle that stretched the limits of both men and machines. It was not just a clash of tanks and artillery, but a psychological confrontation where technological advances, human resolve, and the willingness to adapt were tested in the most brutal conditions. In that snow-covered forest, with the sound of gunfire and explosions ringing through the air, the Sherman tank proved itself to be something much more than just a machine. It became a symbol of resilience and innovation under fire. For the U.S. Army, the survival of the M4 Sherman after direct hits from the feared German 88mm guns sent a powerful message. The myth of the Sherman's fragility was shattered, not by sheer firepower, but by American ingenuity, adaptability, and the unrelenting courage of the men who fought inside them. These tanks, though not perfect, had evolved. They had survived the harshest tests of war and had become tougher, more reliable, and far more resilient than their enemies had ever believed. The Germans, for all their technological superiority, were forced to rethink their assumptions about the battlefield. The 80mm gun, which had once been the ultimate weapon, had lost its aura of invincibility. The American tanks, though still vulnerable, were now a force to be reckoned with. What the Germans had thought would be a decisive victory turned into a psychological setback, not just because of the Sherman's armor, but because of the unpredictability of the Americans' tactics. The Battle of the Bulge was a test of endurance, not just of machines, but of spirit. The American forces, faced with overwhelming odds, had proven that victory was not about having the best weapon, but about never giving up, surviving, adapting, and pushing forward, no matter the cost. This was a lesson that resonated far beyond the snow and mud of Belgium. It was a lesson about the importance of resilience in warfare and about the human capacity to endure. As the war moved toward its inevitable conclusion in 1945, the Sherman tank would remain the backbone of the American armored forces. It would continue to fight, adapt, and survive. The tanks that once seemed weak and vulnerable were now a testament to the power of adaptation and human spirit, and that, perhaps, was their greatest victory.